I want to welcome the GMs and the wives, the godly men and the warm, inviting, feminine, empathetic women out there. I want to talk about today how cannabis and psychedelics can help you heal from generational curses or help you break any generational curses as well. And a quick disclaimer here before we get started. I do not advocate or condone these kinds of or encourage any of these kinds of substances at this point in my life. I do understand that there's a time and a place for these substances, but for the sake of YouTube purposes and legally, I cannot necessarily advocate or encourage this unless you have like a medical license or anything for cannabis. And since psychedelics are still, technically speaking, scheduled as a Schedule 1 drug, then I cannot advocate for that. However, I can say that if you're in a state where, and specifically in the United States, if you're in a state where you have the option to do that and it's not a criminal act to partake in these things, this is where this information is going to come into play. Now, before we get started more into the practicalities of that, well, what exactly are generational curses? And how do you break them? And why is it the case that substances can help you break generational curses? Because in the Bible it says that be sober and be vigilant, for your adversary is a roaring lion, is like a roaring lion, and will seek whom he may devour. So what exactly is that in contrast? Doesn't that contradict? Yes, it does. And I'm not necessarily, this is why I'm saying that I'm not advocating for the use of these substances, because I myself have not partaken in any kind of cannabis for nearly 2 years now, almost to the day. And I haven't taken any kind of like long psychedelic trip. I haven't done a full trip for nearly 3 years. So it's been quite a while for me for these substances, but I can say with absolute certainty that without these substances, I would not be who I am today. So a generational curse is essentially a pattern in your epigenetic system, your mode of being within your family unit or your environment, because epigenetics are environmental, right? So there's certain patterns or forms of behaviors that can get encoded into the DNA, into the child, into their child, into the child after that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's certain forms in which you're going to have to be able to look at this basically from a new dimensional perspective. Because if you think about it, let's take this pen, for example. If this pen, actually, we're going to do like, we'll do a book first. This is a book. Think of this as one-dimensional, right? You can only go one way. But if it's two-dimensional, now you can go the length and the width. But three-dimensional, well, now you have the depth, the width, and the length, right? So now, though, if I were to just hold up this pen, you're looking at this two-dimensionally. You can see that this is just, it would just look like a picture of a pen. This would not necessarily look like anything else until you had the option to hold it or see it or move it forward and backward so that you can see that there's depth and there's a certain space in which it can operate. This is the same kind of thing happens spiritually within our spiritual being. Our spirituality, because we are interdimensional beings, we operate at our soul level from a multidimensional perspective. Whereas within ourselves, just here as human beings, we only see 3 dimensions, or at least we see 2-dimensionally and then we act in 3 dimensions, right? So at the soul level, there's something multidimensional. And there was one time when I was on psychedelics, specifically psilocybin mushrooms, where I kept saying to myself, holy cow, we're in the 4th dimension. We're all the same. We're in the 4th dimension. And I kept seeing this image, but I could only utter those words because the image of what I was seeing in my head was so beautiful and it was so inspiring, but I could only put those words together in that moment. And I could still just see it. I can see the image, but to actually talk about it is completely separate. It's like trying to describe salt to somebody that's never tasted salt. It's like trying to describe the color blue to somebody that's blind. It's something that is very, you'd have to experience it in order to really understand it. And so when I was on this trip, this was years and years ago, because I didn't actually start cannabis, and I primarily smoked it. I did have edibles, but I liked to smoke it because I liked how it made me feel more like I could almost climb into the nooks and crannies of my mind to scour into the depths of spirituality in the moment. Whereas with psychedelics, it was more of a cosmic consciousness kind of a thing. So anyway, with the cannabis, first time I started smoking was when I was like 21. And it was actually my birthday. And we were in Vegas because it was just legalized. And I still remember, man, that was a crazy time. We went to the smoke shop there, and this lady that was helping us, she was like, we didn't know what we were doing. Me and my buddies, we didn't know what we were doing. And then at the time I had a cousin that I was with, and we didn't know what we were talking about. Like, we had no clue. This is our first time. This is our first dispensary that we went to. It was the first time anything. And so the person looks at us and they're like, well, do you want to get couch locked or do you want to like fly high, bro? This is a chick. And I was just like, what the fuck? And my cousin says, what the hell is couch locked? Oh man, that was just so funny because I had no clue what that even meant. But we wanted to get more like into ourselves. We didn't want to be like just a vegetable. We wanted to actually see if this was something that was worth exploring the depths of our mind. And so anyway, there were certain times throughout that evening where I really started to see time slow down, and I could really analyze my own behavior a little bit more. And this is what I found, is that cannabis and psychedelics, they don't really do anything for people that are not intentionally going in it to grow. Because both of these substances are meditative spaces. Like, they just activate a certain thing that you can get sober, by the way. Maybe not as intense, nowhere near as intense as a psychedelic, that's for damn sure. But you can get to certain places where it is like psychedelics or it is like cannabis. I remember even just my first time running for 8+ miles. I remember feeling like, holy crap, I literally feel like I'm on cannabis right now. And that was the runner's high. And I'd never heard of the runner's high before. But actually, I did research, and it turns out that apparently the cannabinoid or the cannabinoid, I don't remember the exact term, but those cannabis receptors in your brain, they actually get activated when you're on a high endurance activity. And so it's almost as if you are actually like high. That's why they call it the runner's high, because you have a certain amount of endorphins and dopamine being released, etc. But you also have those cannabinoid receptors. I don't know if it's cannabinoid or cannabis, but receptors anyway. I don't know the exact term for them in the mind, but those receptors are turned on. And that's one of the reasons why I actually enjoy running now. That's the only reason that I enjoy running. I hate every other aspect of it. but at the time, I didn't realize that was really what it was. And this was like 3 years ago when I first started to experience that, because I was nearly like 200 pounds. And this was another generational curse that I had to break, because I saw throughout my entire life, my whole family would be super healthy until they were like 18 to 25. and then they would just completely fall off and they would never be able to get back on the wagon. And I'm not trying to be rude out here. I'm just saying that that's what it was. They would just let themselves go. And I think nowadays, it actually isn't really that hard to keep yourself in shape. It really isn't. You just have to have a little bit of discipline and make sure that you're being consistent, and you'll be fine. But that's a little bit beside the point here. The point is that the generational curse was gluttony, and it had to do with the sin of gluttony. And there was also having to do with the sin of greed as well. And this was two generational curses. The generational curses do not always have to align strictly within certain sins, but there are patterns of behavior that you can see through time in your family lineage or whatever, or your environment or your friendships, etc., where you see certain patterns take place. And if you don't change those patterns, you're not going to get a different outcome. And so in order to get a different outcome, you have to make certain changes to those patterns. And so if you're saying certain things, if you have certain kinds of relationships, let's say your romantic relationships end up always a certain way. If you're a woman, you always end up with a toxic male, quote unquote, right? And then if you're a male, you always end up with a toxic female, quote unquote. Well, okay, look at what exactly you're doing to attract those kinds of men or women, and look at, well, okay, is this actually on me? What am I doing to attract these kinds of people? Because is it what I'm wearing? Is it the way that I act? Because obviously to get into the door, it's going to be all physical appearance. Number one, it's always all physical appearance. And so you have to make sure, how are you acting in order to attract certain kinds of people into your life? And where are you going? Are you going to certain places? Are you actually engaging with people? Are you actually socializing with the people that you actually want to socialize with? These are just things that you have to look at. And this is one of the reasons why I actually recommend people that are actually going to participate, whatever you want to call it, in cannabis or psychedelics, you do it alone. You do it alone. And I'm not necessarily saying that you can't do it with other people, or you shouldn't, because that is a different kind of form of experience, and you can see certain aspects of other people get exposed through seeing how people react to these substances, and their true colors can come out. I remember on psychedelics one time, I was taking them with a narcissist. Had no idea that this guy was a narcissist until he said something. And my ego, I knew it in my ego on the psychedelic trip, was like, oh, just people please him. Like that was the mode of what was there. And yet I then had a setback, and I like watched myself, and I watched my ego participate with him. And I was like, wait a second. No, I don't need to do that. I don't need to people please this guy. Why am I trying to do that? Is it me, or is he trying to manipulate me? And so in the middle of the psychedelic trip, I was going like, okay, I'm with somebody that might be manipulative. Okay. This is just the truth. This is what I'm here for. All right. Because this is something that I've always learned from cannabis and psychedelics. They almost always will never give you what you want. Like, ever. If you're actually going into it with the archetype of justice, truth, beauty, and goodness in mind, it'll never give you what you want. It'll always give you what you need. And this is why I say that it's actually medicinal. These things are truly medicinal. These things are part of the earth. Thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. We likely, as human beings, we evolved with these things. We evolved with these substances. Why else is it that so many different kinds of animals have cannabinoid receptors or cannabis receptors? I'm really going to have to look that up again, the name of it. But these cannabis receptors in the brain, why is it that we have these anyway? And why is it the case that when we have psychedelics, almost everybody that goes into it with those archetypes of justice, beauty, truth, and goodness in mind, they always come out on the other side with a more newfound reverence for life. That is almost always the case. However, there is a point in which I think we must grow out of these things. We don't need to rely on them. That should be the goal. They're supposed to be a tool. They're not necessarily to be a crutch. And I'm not saying that if you're doing that right now, like, oh, you're crutch, like it's a crutch. I'm just saying that be mindful of really why you're doing it. And the reason that I say silent darkness is because I did try the heroic dose of psychedelics in silent darkness, what Terrence McKenna talked about. And it changed everything. It changed everything about my reality. And I was never the same, in a great way, in a very positive way. But we need to be understanding that, because I do genuinely think that without psychedelics or cannabis, I would have never really come to Christ. I would have never seen the power of the Holy Spirit. I would have never seen Jesus in his glory in everything that I have and available to me at this time. I see Jesus in the sunlight. I see Jesus in the trees. I see Jesus in this pen, in the book. Jesus, for me, is not just a person. He is the essence of the Logos. He is the manifestation of beauty, truth, and goodness, and justice, all together. And he completed the moral compass of humankind so that we can understand our own mistakes and that we can learn from these things. That's where these substances really showed me the depth of Jesus's true nature. And I'm not saying that like I found Jesus doing these substances, but I kind of did. Like I kind of did. I just didn't know it. I didn't know that was what it was like. That's what it would be called eventually. Because the first time I did psychedelics, I remember just there was nothing going on in my mind in a way that I was completely present. I was completely present. There was no thoughts. I remember looking up at the tree outside. I was just laying in the grass looking up at the tree. And it was as if the tree was like reaching out to me saying, like, hello, you've always been here. We know that you're there. And we're so glad to see that you're actually seeing something more. Holy cow. I felt more connection to nature. And it wasn't like I was like talking to the trees. I was a tree hugger. No, it was like these trees are a life form. Every part of life, no matter what it is, no matter how big, no matter how small, every aspect of life is to be respected. And this is what a lot of my generational curses, they didn't want me to go through. Like these generational curses are there for a reason. The generational curses are there to stop you from ascending closer to the source of creation, to growing and ascending in the kingdom of God. Because we have no true authority over that which only God has given us. The only authority that we have comes from God. So it's your spiritual being that is the most powerful. Everybody talks about titles. Everybody talks about this. Everybody talks about that. What matters is your spiritual presence at the end of the day. And you only get spiritual presence through understanding the depths of sorrow and hardship and suffering. Because if you don't go through those things, and this is why cannabis and psychedelics were able to help me break these curses. It's because I was able to see things that I would never have been able to see if I was sober. 100%. 100%. And this is not to say that I wouldn't have been able to do it sober, but I saw things and my mind was open to new kinds of concepts in ways that I never would have been open to or understood if it weren't for these substances. So with that being said, I hope this message was useful and insightful. And until next time, peace be with you.